I'm going to ask everybody to stand up while my panel is coming, because like children shouldn't sit for so long, neither should adults. So why don't you stretch a little bit? Okay, and I'm going to announce it. Okay, we're going to get started. Good afternoon. This has been an incredible day. We've been witness to what is going on around the world for children. We're here to bear witness. We're here to reach out to them. We're here to find solutions for them. And I just want to pick up on Donald's point about children in the margin. I kind of feel like if you put all these children together, they are the center. And they are the center of our work here today. This is a very important day. It's a very important topic. We've heard about 3 different groups of children, although they may be overlapping. I should point out children living outside of family care, children reflecting the ethnic and linguistic diversity, specifically Roma children, and children with developmental delays and disabilities. Now we turn to another group of children, children on the move, migrants, immigrants, and refugees. And I should point out that these terms are different depending on where you live. These children have been referenced throughout the day. In many ways, this is the group of children we see on the front pages of our papers every day around the world. A group of children who have often experienced violent conflicts and economic hardships, only to face the loss of their home and their communities, their friends, and their relatives. In many ways, this group of children face all the challenges that we've heard throughout the day. They often have to live without supportive family members in communities with different cultures and languages. If they are children with atypical development to begin with, experiencing violence and forced migration will only compound the stress in their lives. For young children, we know this prolonged stress has serious impacts on their developing brain and on their developing heart. In this historic moment, this group of children needs our attention and our ongoing support. It's our hope, all of us on the panel, that this session will discuss the current situation, highlight some potential solutions, but more than anything, we hope it encourages you to act, to do something to address the current crisis that many of these children are facing. Before I introduce the panel, I should say that Victoria Bola, the policy officer for the Early Childhood Education and Care at the European Commission, could not be with us today. She was originally supposed to be our chair. However, she asked me to share part of her message. She sends her regrets at not being able to be here due to many pressing issues, as you can imagine. Of the several hundreds of thousands of people arriving in the EU as asylum seekers, 1 in 4 are children. Furthermore, thousands of unaccompanied children are trafficked into and throughout the EU. The arriving refugees form a very diverse group in terms of culture, language, religion, educational background. There is a clear frame to provide refugee children with education, and there are also specific provisions for asylum seekers waiting for a decision. The current refugee crisis demands action in many areas of social and education policies. Disadvantaged and migrant children can benefit greatly, we all know, from early childhood services. The EU civil protection mechanism can be activated by a member state if it feels overwhelmed by the crisis. This includes various types of in-kind assistance, including modules, shelter, medical supplies, and other food items. Victoria says that one of the Commission departments publishes a summary of innovative approaches to the integration of migrants, and we're going to be making that available to all of you today. So now let me turn to the panel. I'm going to introduce all three of them, and they'll speak in sequence. I first want to start with Eskinder Nagash, who's the Senior Vice President of Global Engagement at the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants. It was this delight and pleasure for me to serve with Eskinder in the Obama administration. He was there from 2009 to 2015 and in charge of the Refugee Resettlement Program. Then we'll hear from Suna Hanos, who's a senior specialist, Mother and Child Education Foundation in Aceh in Turkey, and we're particularly excited to have her with us because she's got extensive on-the-ground experience working with families the most impacted. And then finally, we'll hear from Alison Parker, who is the director of U.S. Programs for Human Rights Watch, a very important organization, and she's got extensive experience with families of refugees in emergencies around the world. We'll then take a few clarifying questions and then hear from Jan Peters, who's the director of innovations in Early Years Research Center for Early Childhood in Ghent. It's really a delight for me to turn this over to Eskinder Nagash. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Joan. Yeah, it was actually a pleasure to work with you during the Obama administration. I think it still is going on. It is. During lunch, Joan asked me a question, and I tried to figure out. She says, we have to be careful. We need to actually define the language. Who is a refugee? How do we define it? So I thought about it, and I said, there is a legal definition about refugees, and that's the 1951 Convention of how we define refugees. And then I realized there is actually a different definition about refugees. And so I'm just going to start and giving you a little bit of a historical perspective of a refugee, and I will give you a global perspective. And my colleague Alison actually focus in the region, especially the Central American region. So a friend of mine once reminded me about refugee, and he said, remember, he said, refugees have been around since 3,017 years ago. I said, what? And I said, I only know the 1951 Convention. He said, well, remember to read your Bible. Remember, in Bible and the Quran and the Torah, there is actually a very significant portion of how to define refugees. In fact, it says, be kind to strangers. That was actually the first definition that I guess in the Bible, and there is a section apparently in the Bible, it's called Exodus. So that's, John, my way of defining it. But the 1951 Convention after the Second World War, which is interestingly designed and defined by European, and I'm happy to remind my European colleagues here, that definition was a European definition, but I'm afraid that definition may be forgotten. So this is what it says. Yeah. A refugee is someone outside his or her country of nationality who is unable or unwilling to return back because of persecution or a well-founded fear of persecution on an account of race, religion, nationality, membership in particular social group, or a political opinion. So that's the definition, because the reason I think we need to define it is the media, especially European media, tend to define things a little bit loosely. They, because we keep hearing migrants, this and that, but these are actually refugees based on the 1951 definition, which European countries decided actually to define it at that time after the war. So I have, by 2014 refugee hosting countries. I wanted to give it to you. 20% of global refugees reside in Asia and the Pacific region. 64% of them are actually Afghans, and they left, many, many years ago. They're probably in Iran, in Pakistan, and some other countries. 26% of global refugees resides in sub-Saharan Africa. Some of them are Somalis, Eritreans. In fact, Eritreans have been in eastern Sudan since 1964. They have been refugee camp. There are about 120,000 refugees there. Imagine being a refugee and then at the same time born and raised as a child in refugee camp for that many years. And then we have about 5% of global refugees reside in America. So these are mostly from Central American countries. In 2014, the top 5 countries of hosting refugees were Turkey, of course, was 1.6 million. Pakistan is still mostly the Afghan, as I said, 1.5. And about 20% of the population, I think now, in Lebanon which is about 4 million people. I believe they have close to 1.15 million. Imagine it's about 20% of the population in Lebanon currently are refugees. The global overview is what Joan suggested that I do that. In 2014, the UN Refugee Agency, that's the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, that was actually created in 1951, reported 60 million forcibly displaced people worldwide. 60 million people. I mean, this, in my view, is probably the highest number since World War II. So 10 years ago, if you go back 10 years ago, we had about 38 million refugees. Now it is 60 million refugees. Imagine that the number of people today who are either IDPs, these are internally displaced people, or asylees, and refugees were a population of a country. Just so I can imagine that. It would be the 24th largest country in the world. 24th largest country in the world. That's incredible number. And the sad part of this is I know that we're talking about Syrian refugees and the new migration in Europe, but some of these refugees have been in a refugee camp, warehouse for many, many years. In fact, in the Middle East, you can go back to 1948, refugees in Lebanon and Syria. And in fact, the reason you see a lot of Syrians and others moving to Europe is they don't want to stay in a refugee camp for 20, 30, 40 years, because there is no hope for them. These are kids, they see around them. I say, gee, am I going to be here 20 years? Even the Eritrean refugees who are going to Ethiopia and Sudan, what they see is former refugees still in a refugee camp. So they decided the best thing to do is take a risk. Either die trying or, God willing, succeed. So that's why you see people are just taking the risk of going, and some of them are dying in some Saharan countries, some of them are victims of human trafficking, some of them are becoming actually organ harvest is a new term I heard. Some of the refugees are being killed and their organ has been sold. So that's what we have. And I don't mean to depress you, but this is really what's going on. So again, I don't want to define the legal definition of unaccompanied minors. I think you guys probably know it better than I do. But in Syria, since this is, a few years ago, Syria used to host 2 million refugees. The people of Syria opened their door to 2 million refugees, mostly from Iraq, went to their country. Now, Syrians are becoming refugees. Imagine the number of Syrians now in Turkey, in Lebanon, in Egypt, in Jordan. Jordan is actually now has more refugees. If we actually decided to count the Palestinian refugees in Jordan, I'm afraid that 75% of the population is non-Jordanian. That's what you have. So what you see in Syria, and look at the number of people going in the surrounding area. These are new refugees. This is unbelievable. This is historic proportion. I don't believe there is a record to show that this number of refugees and this number of children, especially children, are becoming refugees, and sometimes people call them migrant. But in my view, they are refugees in search of protection. They're actually asking just protection to live a life, a decent life, consistent with what some of you prefer calling it the convention. So that's what we have in Syria. I am using an old data. I'm afraid I didn't have the 2015 data. So what you see in my presentation is the 2014 data. Africa, it's really a sad story what you have there, especially for the children. Let me just give you one example. In 1951, the only refugee camp in my research I found is in Europe. So, no refugee camp in Africa existed prior to 1951, except maybe after the Algiers, crisis. Maybe we created a temporary refugee camp for Algerians, but prior to that, refugees are nowhere to be found as a camp. They existed, but nobody actually had a camp at that time. The only camp was in 1951, probably refugees in Europe. So now Africa is becoming a land of refugee and refugee camps. I went to Dadaab refugee camp in Kenya in 2010. When I was there were 350,000 refugees. Recently, I checked, that number is close to 500,000. The second largest city in Kenya is a refugee camp in Dadaab. And Kenya has also another refugee camp, which is a Kakuma refugee camp. So that number is there, and most of the time the media doesn't really want to talk to you because, again, not all refugees are equal. Sometimes some refugees are better than some others. So, but what you see in Africa is 58% of children in Africa, and the refugees are from East Africa. 55% in Central Africa, Great Lakes area, that's Congo and Rwanda and Burundi, and overall that number is actually on a daily basis increasing. And I don't actually believe that the number will go down. In fact, the newest country in Africa, after fighting since 1955, in 2011 they signed a peace agreement and they declared a new nation, is now sending more refugees to Kenya and to Ethiopia. In 1993, the newest country, Eritrea, became a nation after a referendum. Now Eritrea is sending more refugees. In fact, most of the European migration you see coming from Africa is mostly Eritrean refugees, because they have a system where every child has to be, at the age of maybe 14, 15, has to join the military, indefinite military service. There is no future, there is no hope. So now we have over 100,000 Eritrean refugees, most of them children in Ethiopia, in Sudan, as I said, since 1964. So that's what you see. And then the newest country, South Sudan, is also sending, because of the current civil war they're having, the power struggle actually, if I may, sending also thousands of refugees to Kenya and to Ethiopia. The Americas, this is an area I think Alison will be talking more about it. But, when I was working for the Obama administration in 2009, by the time I left from 2009 to 2015, I had 135,000 children in my custody. When I say in my custody, actually, I'm legally responsible for every child that's coming because they were actually, I was responsible to give medical consent for every child. At the lunchtime, John asked me how many children I have. I was going to say, well, in 2014, I had 54,000, because truly I was responsible by law to make sure that they get a proper service and protection. There are some people who believe that we didn't provide a good service, which may be legitimate, but we had that many refugees, in my opinion, coming from Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. These are countries of origin, and one information I want to share with you about this population is Guatemala actually sent more Mayan refugees. These are indigenous people who don't actually speak Spanish, even though they're coming from Guatemala. So that number is increasing. This is the area, and I have been to El Salvador many times. In fact, I have a small program in a place called Usulutan, trying to help children being deported from the U.S. and Mexico to help them actually not to take that journey again. So recently, when I was here in June, we had 626 murder. So El Salvador is the #1 murder capital when it comes to children. And then, of course, Honduras and Guatemala also have the same issue. Again, I will skip the Mexico border and the service that Mexico and others are doing. When I said Mexico, Mexico is actually becoming the #1 deporter of unaccompanied minors coming from Central America. Some people think that because the U.S. is outsourcing that work. When I was recently in San Salvador, we had about 263 children being returned from Mexico, the border of Mexico, to San Salvador. These are children coming in, and that number will continue. And the EU is again, this is in your backyard, so you know it better than I do. But I just wanted to say something, since I have been doing this work for many, many years, and I tend to focus on the history of it. In 1957, because I think you keep hearing, Hungary is doing this and that, blocking it. In 1957, the United States government decided to resettle 37,000 refugees from Hungary in the U.S. 37,000. This is 1956, 1957. In fact, we had a law at that time. President Eisenhower actually came up with, that quota. Now, remember how people forget. Now, Hungary is now blocking some of these refugees to enter, or at least even give them, safe passage to other countries. But unfortunately, we tend to repeat history, and this is what's going on. So I will, skip the EU because I think you probably know it. Then the next one is Asia, which I don't really have a lot of data for, unfortunately, but most of the refugees who've been in Pakistan and Iran. In Iran, actually, it's not a camp, it's actually urban setting, are mostly Afghans. And I don't have really a very good data to share with you in terms of how many children are in refugee camps, because as you know, we have now a new group of people becoming victims because of their religion, is the Rohingya refugees from Burma, and nobody wants to actually accept them. I think sometimes, sometimes if we want to be honest, the discussion we have about refugees tends to focus also on religion. What religion? I think that seems to be the elephant in the room sometimes when we have this open discussion. So the Rohingyas are Muslims, and nobody seems to want them. So they are floating around, I believe, in some part of the sea. Again, the host countries, as I mentioned, Turkey, Indonesia, Pakistan, Okay. Are still the Nepalese refugees. These are also stateless people. Keep in mind, Bhutan decided to actually kick out Bhutanese, even though they were ethnic Nepalese, so they have been refugees. We have accepted in the U.S. about 60,000 Bhutanese. It was history of living in Bhutan as Bhutanese, but they happen to be ethnic Nepalese. So that number is still there, and there's a lot of newcomers are coming into the system. So finally, I believe that we have to rethink the 1951 convention. Look at the definition and see whether that definition really applies now. This is an issue that's very dear to me because I believe that we have actually excluded a lot of people simply because sometimes we use a legal definition to prevent people, to treat them like refugees. So that's something I think, you guys also need to think about it and see how we can actually change the system. We need to encourage UNHCR. UNHCR is the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. It is an agency who have been providing camp management, if you will. A lot of refugee camps are under UNHCR. But unfortunately, the number of refugees in urban setting is also growing, where UNHCR may not have a mandate to provide services. Again, UNHCR is an agency who are actually in need of a lot of funding. UNHCR funding usually comes from member agency countries, but I think given the magnitude of refugees they are dealing with, I think they need to be supported. The U.S. government also must prioritize raising the number of unaccompanied refugee minors coming into the country. We used to have a different pipeline called Unaccompanied Refugee Minors. That program started in 1978. When I was working with the administration, we had close to 1,500. These are refugees processed overseas and come to the U.S., and then we have a state system. The state takes a custody of a child. It will be in foster care facilities, and the Department of Health and Human Services will be the agency providing the funding. So that's a global overview I wanted to share with you, and then perhaps we'll have time for question and answer. But given that you have been reading about refugees and you have been, listening and sometimes watching a gruesome picture of a child dying in Greece and other places, and there is a discussion now also to open a camp. I'm not sure that's a very good thing to do, but this is really a crisis of our time. I think we need to ask a question: how do we want to remember? Remember people in 1940, 1945 about refugees? It's about actually a program and refugees, Jewish refugees, in the 1940, 1945, from Czechoslovakia, from Poland, from other places. What happened to them when they went to, England? So this is our time to be remembered. How do we want to remember in this crisis? Do we want to remember just simply listening and reading, or do we want to remember we did something about it, or did we say something about it? So I wanted to close my remark by quoting Martin Luther King Jr., since we talked a little bit about civil rights. He says once, "Our lives begin to end the day we became silent about things that matter." I think this refugee crisis matters, and I think silence is not what we wanted to do. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me clearly? Yes. Okay. I'm from Turkey. My name is Suna, and I'm representing AÇEV. So, briefly on AÇEV. AÇEV is a national NGO based in Turkey, founded in 1993, and we conduct research, run awareness-raising campaigns, develop science-based early childhood development, parenting, and adult education programs, which I'll be talking about today briefly, since the time is really short. The programs in Turkey are implemented for the socioeconomically disadvantaged groups through partnerships with key ministries, such as Ministry of Education, Agriculture, Ministry of Family and Social Affairs. It's important to note that Turkish education system is very centralized, so unless you partner with the ministries, there's no way you can implement your programs in schools and scale up across the country. In addition to implementing programs in Turkey, currently we're internationally implementing programs in Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, Germany, Laos, and Brazil. And in the past years, AÇEV has implemented programs in other countries as well. Now, through face-to-face education programs, just to give you a clear idea about how many people have been reached, AÇEV has reached more than 800,000 children, parents, illiterate adults. These are the direct beneficiaries of the programs, and this has been achieved by training over 11,000 trainers to date, because we're only about 35 of us in the headquarters office in Istanbul, but then we train master trainers who train supervisors, who train the trainers in the field. Now, AÇEV has vast experience in various contexts with vulnerable populations. And 14 years ago, AÇEV decided that it was critical to work with the in-country migrants. Because in the big cities, in the big provinces of Turkey, we have a lot of migrants who've come from the rural context, And so we have programs that particularly support the women and young children. And providing children for a fair start to life through schooling was critical, and Achev launched the summer preschool program. I personally have been doing work in southeastern Turkey, in Diyarbakır and Mardin, for the last 5 years. And this is a summer preschool program. Very briefly, let me tell you about it. It's a short course program that's implemented with the Kurdish populations. And Kurdish populations in Turkey, in ways, has similar characteristics and needs to the Roma populations in Europe due to Kurdish language spoken at home, but then the school system expects them to speak Turkish, low socioeconomic status of families, they're deprived of basic services, and they're marginalized due to ethnic identity. And knowing the importance of integrating parents into the process, this program is paired. It's a paired curriculum, basically, for mothers and their children. This program aims to reach preschool-age children and their mothers through a 10-week-long summer intensive curriculum, where those vulnerable Kurdish children have an opportunity to be prepared to enter first grade in a Turkish public school, while equipping their mothers with the knowledge and skills necessary to support their children's development. Now, at the end of the 10 weeks, children, first of all, we reach 6-year-old children who have not benefited from any form of ECD services until that point, and they're prepared for primary school by enhancing their development. At the same time, their mother's awareness enhances, knowledge and skills on child development increases, and they have positive child-rearing attitudes, and their negative disciplining methods are reduced through the mother support program that they attend once a week for 10 weeks. In fact, 2 weeks, additionally, fathers are invited to meetings. And this whole thing is done basically by recruiting, training, and supervising a local project team to conduct the preschool education program and the mother support program and the father meetings. So a local staff is developed so that at the end of the 10 weeks when we leave the area has actually a good set of trainers as well. An incentive that we've always used is transfer all program-related equipment and newly furnished preschool classrooms to the Ministry of Education, because we use their empty schools over the summer because we don't have all that infrastructure. And the second program that I'll be talking about is the mother-child education program that we've been implementing with the refugees, the Palestinian refugees in Beirut, Lebanon. Since 2011, we've been partnering with UNICEF and Yale University to research linkages between ECD and peace building. And as part of that work, Yale has been involved in the assessment of Achev's program in the Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon. Through an early childhood development parenting program, we are, as Achev, promoting family well-being and reducing violence in the refugee camps. And again, very briefly, let me give you some idea about the program. Its mother-child education program consists of 25 weeks. And as the group leader, we only face the mothers. But the program serves preschool-age children and their mothers, because over the 25 weeks, mothers learn about how to effectively interact with their children. And this project that we've been implementing in Beirut, it's a three-legged partnership. Yale has been doing the research. Achev is the organization that transfers the know-how. And in Beirut, in Lebanon, there's a local NGO called the Arab Resource Collective, and they're the implementing organization. The mother-child education program brings 15 to 20 mothers of 4 to 6-year-old children together. So basically, mothers come together, and they all have children who are going to start first grade the following year. And MOSEP is the acronym for the program. MOSEP meetings begin with a group-wide discussion of the weekly child development topic, led by an Achev-trained group leader. Later in the session, mothers gather around the tables and they learn about how to best interact with their children and how to implement the targeted worksheets that they're supposed to do with their children every day at home. Now, rigorous studies done in MOSEP in Turkey over the last 20 years have shown positive long-term impact of MOSEP on the child's acquisition of socio-emotional skills, executive functioning, and cognitive development. At the same time, mothers have shown improved patterns of parenting by becoming more responsive to their child and less harsh in their disciplining methods. Now, what we're doing in Beirut is we're trying to see the effects on the refugee families, because refugee camps because from this point onwards, I'm going to be talking about the work that we're planning on doing with the Syrian refugees in Turkey. Beirut, the refugee camps in Beirut are long-term settlements, unlike the recent camps built in Turkey. I'll skip the father support program. So the scale, I will not repeat what Eskinder said, but very briefly, scale of displacement has increased dramatically in Turkey, and the impact of displacement crisis is being felt increasingly beyond the neighborhood of Syria. And there are about 2 million registered and 250,000 unregistered refugees in Turkey. And if it goes like this, it's expected that 2.5 million refugees will be in Turkey by 2016. Now, only about 220,000 are in camps. The rest, about 1.7 million, are all around Turkey in the streets. So we're thinking about how to actually reach these people through our programs. Until now, managing the presence of obviously 2 million refugees has not been an easy task. It has been also complicated by the initial reluctance of the Turkish government to seek international assistance. So it must be acknowledged that the government itself was slow in developing effective cooperation with the INGOs. And until a year ago, they were also very wary of national NGOs. Now, there are certain challenges. Education and employment is definitely a challenge. So it has to be addressed immediately for large populations. Strengthening Turkey's reception and integration system has to get better because there's a serious risk of xenophobia. We hear that when we go into the field right now that the second shift has been opened up in many public schools in southeastern and south parts of Turkey. However, the Syrian children are not able to attend the schools because the Turkish children are very much bullying them. And there has to be a coordinated global and humanitarian response because it's evident that there has to be a burden sharing within the global community. So this will be my last slide. What can we do? Based on Achev's previous expertise in early childhood programs, working with refugees in other countries and in-country migrants like I've mentioned, Achev is planning on providing training and content and guide of establishment of learning centers for young children. Many Turkish NGOs are worried about local constituency as there remains great need for vulnerable people in Turkey and diverting resources may be criticized, so need to maintain a balance. So what we're thinking of doing is maybe combining projects where we actually reach the Kurdish population and now the Syrian refugee population together. What can academic institutions do? So perhaps the first thing is to ensure awareness is maintained and do research on the project implementation so that we can learn from this crisis and see what works and how are children affected that we can use this for a future crisis. Thank you.
As she's coming up, it's really terrific to have concrete steps that we can all take, and I think that's the whole goal here. So Alison, sorry.
Good afternoon. It's a privilege for me to be here with you all today. My name is Alison Parker, and I direct the U.S. program of Human Rights Watch. There we go. So the U.S. program of Human Rights Watch, just to explain what Human Rights Watch does for one brief moment. What we do is investigate human rights abuses wherever they occur. We do this in 90 countries around the world. We then expose our findings, normally through use of the media. And then our final and most important goal is to press policymakers to achieve change. Today, my goal is to speak to you about the experience of child migrants inside the United States. And what I'd like to do is talk about 4 categories of migrants. I'm using the term migrant very deliberately because I'm not speaking about people who have been recognized as refugees, whom Eskender spoke about so eloquently earlier. I'm talking about people who are arriving to seek asylum in the United States, or people who are migrants and wouldn't fit the definitions that he spoke about earlier. So the 4 categories that I wanted to talk to you about today include, first of all, unaccompanied child migrants. Secondly, families who are separated across, in general, the U.S.-Mexico border. Third, children who are migrating with family members. And fourth, child migrant workers inside the United States. Our work in the United States to end abuse against child migrants is done in a very simple way. We travel directly to the locations where children are living. That means we go to their homes, we go to the border regions, we go to workplaces, and we go to detention centers inside the United States where they can be found. And what we do is document their experiences, to hear directly from them what those experiences are, and then to bring those experiences to policymakers. So I'd like to start with the first category I mentioned, and that is unaccompanied child migrants. These migrants at the moment in the United States are generally arriving from the U.S.-Mexico border. They're coming from Central America. They are also coming from Mexico. And I'd like to share with you just one story to begin with. Jose is a young man that we met in a detention center inside Mexico. Jose comes from Guerrero in Mexico, and he's lived his life without parental involvement in his care. Starting from the age of 8, Jose began trying to cross into the United States. He's done this 3 times. All 3 times, he's been deported alone. Jose explained to us when we spoke to him in that detention center in Mexico that for the last 2 attempts that he's made to enter the United States, he has done so while being involved in a criminal organization. This is a very common experience for children migrating. So what that means is that a criminal organization recruited him and involved him in the practice of human smuggling. That's what it means in Jose's case. There are many other ways in which children are now being recruited into and involved in criminal organizations. So just some brief statistics about unaccompanied child migrants in the U.S. We expect in 2015 that there will be some 41,000 unaccompanied child migrants who will arrive in the U.S. from Mexico and Central America. The abuses that we have documented that these young people have endured include sexual violence, trafficking, involvement with international criminal groups, and lack of access to food, water, education, and shelter. Children told us time and again that they fear for their lives if they attempt to leave the control of international criminal groups or traffickers. And lastly, we are deeply concerned at Human Rights Watch about the fact that U.S. law contains no requirement for border authorities to consider the best interests of children in their custody. This includes any requirement to hear directly from children themselves about their own interests and perspectives on their situation. I'd like to move now to the second category of migrants I wanted to highlight for you today, and that is families separated across the border. I'd like to ask our colleagues in the back to help me here. I have a short film that I would like to play that will help to really illustrate some of these problems for you. Hopefully it will work. Perhaps as we're trying to get it up on the screen, I'll just describe for you the fact that young migrant children are separated from their caregivers every single week in the United States. And the reason for this is that, as many of you may know, we have some 12 million undocumented people living inside the United States. We also have many people who are immigrants who face deportation from the United States after a conviction for a criminal offense. So what happens, okay, I'll stop here and let's just hear briefly from the short film clip.
Which is a place where I was born, but I really don't know anybody. I don't even know where to go. I don't even know what to do, you know, like I just can't believe it. Like my life was in Phoenix, not here.
There are many people today who've been deported who have incredibly strong ties to the U.S. through family, through community, and they're desperate to return, but there's no legal way for them to return.
To be separated from my mom and my three brothers, I can't even explain the pain that I feel right now.
Under current law, people who've been deported, no matter what their family ties are, have no legal way to come back to the U.S. And what we want U.S. immigration law to include is a way for these people to apply to enter legally and to be with their families.
Pues ese día que me arrestaron fue la última vez que yo vi a mis hijas. Hace ya 2 años y 4 meses, exactamente.
Alicia lived in the U.S. for 10 years. She has 2 daughters who were born here, which makes them U.S. citizens. But after all those years together, she was deported for being in the U.S. illegally, and her children ended up in foster care. She was desperate to get back to them. So she tried to enter. She was caught and criminally prosecuted and sentenced to 13 days.
Yo le pedí al juez, por favor, que no fuera tan duro conmigo y que no me diera mucho tiempo de castigo, que me dejara mucho tiempo adentro de la cárcel, porque yo le dije que me perdonara porque estaba yo haciendo eso y que yo lo estaba haciendo solo porque quería estar con mis hijas.
The U.S. government is prosecuting tens of thousands of people like Alicia, people who are desperate to get back to their families, who have minor or no criminal records, but who have no legal way of returning. And when they try to enter illegally, they end up in prison at taxpayer expense.
So, as I think that film clip illustrates, we have a massive problem with the separation of families as a result of U.S. immigration and immigration enforcement policies. As I said, and as the stories that were related in that short clip make clear, young migrant children are separated from their families every week. There are now 4.1 million U.S. citizen children who have undocumented parents. And as I was saying before we played the film, these parents are living constantly at risk of deportation. So they have to make the heart-wrenching decision either to bring their children with them, often to a country that no one in the family remembers, or to agree to be deported and to leave their U.S. citizen children inside the United States. As you can imagine, and as Alicia's story illustrates, these parents then repeatedly try to cross the border again to reunite, and yet U.S. law prosecutes them, puts them in U.S. prisons, and deports them again. As you can imagine, the children who face this family separation, we've documented again and again in our investigations, face increased levels of anxiety, psychological harm, impacts on their well-being due to the reduced resources of the family. This is often because the main breadwinner and caregiver is the person who's deported, poor school performance, and isolation from family due to being placed in the foster care system. And this is just a beautiful photograph of one of those families who is currently living separated with the father deported. The next and third group that I'd like to talk to you about are infants and children migrating to the U.S. with their caregivers. Inside the U.S. now, we have children, and again, arriving mostly from Mexico and Central America, and they're traveling with their mothers to seek asylum. The main policy that the U.S. government uses to address this group of people is to place them in detention. So they're first held in Border Patrol lockups, which are lockups that are notorious because of their freezing cold conditions. We've heard again and again from detainees about the insufficient food they're provided with, or inappropriate food, culturally insensitive food, and then the illnesses in that the children endure in these conditions. After being held in these lockups, they're then sent to detention centers where they're afforded no privacy and told when to eat, when to sleep, and when to wake up. Currently, the U.S. has 4,000 beds in 3 different family detention centers inside the United States. So just to bring this to a very human level, I thought I'd relate to you a story of a 6-year-old girl whom I'll call Camila. Camila arrived in the United States from Colombia. And her family had endured persecution in Colombia. They had been targeted by a criminal organization called the Águilas Negras, the Black Eagles. Her family was targeted in Colombia by this group because her family had actually tried to help the police in investigating and prosecuting this group. And as a result, Camila's mother was attacked by one of the gang members. So they fled. They arrived in the United States in Georgia. And what happened to Camila and her family next just helps to illustrate the problems that asylum seekers sometimes encounter in the U.S. Camila was put into detention immediately upon arrival in the state of Georgia in the United States. She's 6 years old. She was separated from her parents, whom she had fled with. And this was because the U.S. believes it's very important to put migrants and asylum seekers in detention in order to deter new arrivals from coming. So because of this desire to put these migrants in detention, Camila was placed in foster care because in Georgia there were no detention facilities that were set up to house mothers with their children. Camila's mother was desperate, and she sat in a detention center not knowing where her 6-year-old child was for 2 weeks. Eventually, the U.S. authorities decided to reunite the family by placing them in detention in a family detention center in Pennsylvania. And we met Camila and her mother and interviewed them there in that detention center in Pennsylvania, where Camila just cried through the entire interview. So what is clear, I would think, from the story I just related is that infants and children, even when they're migrating with their family members, have often experienced pre-migration trauma. They have psychological and health consequences that have come about because of the hostile reception that they've received in the United States and because of the prison-like conditions of detention that they've been held in. I will say, to give a slight ray of hope, that thanks to the advocacy by Human Rights Watch and many other partner organizations in the U.S., the length of time that families have to spend in detention in the U.S. has been shortened. Unfortunately, there's been much mention of unintended consequences. Unfortunately, now we see the mothers of these children are being forced to wear ankle bracelets So while they're no longer detained, they are shackled, and this is raising new issues for the children about the shame they feel in seeing their mothers treated that way. As time is short, I'm going to just run through a last group of migrant children inside the United States, and that is child migrant workers. I'm not sure how many people are aware that in the U.S. we have somewhere between 300,000 and 800,000 children working in the agricultural industry in the United States. Most child labor is outlawed in the U.S., but there's a major exception for farm work. And what this means is that you can now find in the U.S. very young workers, kids as young as 7, 8, or 9, who are working in our fields. We've interviewed kids as young as 7 who are picking strawberries in Florida, children as young as 8 who are picking and shucking peas in Virginia, and 7-year-olds in Texas who are hoeing cotton. Children this young typically attend school and work only part of the day. The harm that's been suffered by these migrant workers includes the fact that they're dropping out of school. Some of them have physical injuries because of working with farm equipment. Some have been exposed to nicotine poisoning because they work in tobacco, and others have been exposed to pesticides and endured other types of physical abuse. Again, a little bit of good news. Due to our advocacy, U.S. law was changed in 2015 to ban children under the age of 18 from handling pesticides. So that has been one small improvement in this area. I'd like to end with some lessons learned. And these, I have to say, are drawn from my experience of working with the 4 types of child migrants I mentioned inside the United States. I don't know that they're relevant to every global context in which all of you work, but I think we must grapple with at least some of them in order to fully respect the human rights and dignity of child migrants. So I'll just run through them very quickly. Number 1, I think we need to recognize the trauma that children have experienced both before and after migration. Number 2, I think the border is an incredibly important moment where we need to address how children are received and give access for service providers at that crucial moment. Number 3, we need to embrace the best interests of children in our reception policies for migrants. Number 4, don't separate families. Number 5, prohibit the detention of children, including the detention of children with their family members. Number 4, prohibit the employment of children. Number 7, address sensitively the reality that children all around the world are victims of criminal organizations. And number 8, and this is a refrain that many have already repeated, but I have to say it myself as well, and that is we need to integrate health, legal, and social services and negotiate with border and government authorities to ensure that those kinds of holistic services are provided to migrant families. Thank you so much.
Alison, thank you especially for that ending list, which I think we should all take home with us. So finally, you've been sitting a long time, but we're going to hear from Jan Peters in a policy response about a project that's been going on across borders.
Yeah. Okay, after this touching stories, I will talk more about how we can invest in early childhood education for refugee children and for migrant children. I will focus on the kind of opportunities that children need, and therefore we have organized until now 6 forums. Okay. For policymakers and for researchers to discuss relevant issues on early childhood education. And I will only talk about, because I have a limited time, on those issues on which policymakers, in total there were more than 100 policymakers from the United States and from Europe, and also 120 leading researchers, and I will focus on those issues on which policymakers and researchers agreed. which is very important, is the whole question of access. And what we are seeing is that in a lot of studies, there is a lot of focus on accessibility, and of course accessibility for refugee children is very important. But which is also very important is that they must be useful, desirable and also meaningful to migrant families and to refugee families. Because especially refugee families, sometimes the only thing that they have when they are in that country are their young children. And a lot of the refugee parents do not want to give their young children to early childhood education. So we must invest a lot in convincing them that early childhood education can be very useful for them and for their children. And in general, there are a lot of policy documents who are speaking about hard-to-reach parents, but when we discussed it in those 6 forums, we think that the real problem is not hard-to-reach parents, but it's hard-to-reach services. This means that a lot of services do not have the right attitude to reach migrant parents and also refugee parents. And then workforce preparation was another topic of the second forum we did. And I think of course, there are a lot of things that we have to focus on, what we have to learn children. But another thing is, what is very important for the workforce is that they have the competences to work in a context of hyper-diversity, and especially in the United States and Western Europe, we are seeing that, and now with all the new refugees that are coming to Europe, we are seeing that it's really in a lot of classrooms in early childhood education, there is a confrontation with sometimes children of 35, 40 different nationalities that speak different languages, and that requires special competences. And therefore, it's very important that we focus on reflective competences. Another thing that all the forum agreed on was that we should avoid ethnic matching. It's in the beginning, it's always interesting to have kind of bridge figures. For instance, from now we expect a lot of people from Syria, so you could try to hire a person from Syria. But in the long term, it's not very effective. What we are doing is we have to train people that are able, that have the competency to work with with people from very different origins. And then also very important is that the continuous professional development is as important for the workforce as the initial training. And which kind of competences do we need? And I think it's very important that we have a workforce with an openness to dialogue with parents, that there is an engagement and ability to work towards social change. I think it's very important. In all the visits I've done, for instance, for people working with Roma children, it was also what Margaret told this morning, you have to believe in children, you have to believe that children are able to develop. And I experienced that a lot of early childhood workers are so used to work with children from their ethnic background that they don't believe that children from ethnic minority backgrounds, that they have huge potential to grow. And then then another important thing is the continuous professional development, and I did together with a lot of other researchers, we did a systematic review on which kind of interventions are really effective, which has an effect on the quality of the service, but also on the outcomes of the children. And we started with more than 20,000 European studies, and at the end we ended with 70 studies, which are all of high quality. And what we learned from that is that intensive CPD programs that are effective, they require an active involvement of the practitioners. That's very important. They must very focused on practitioners learning in practice. That's also another important thing, and also important is that there is a coach, and that coach is available during non-contact hours. And it must be embedded in a coherent pedagogical framework or curriculum that builds upon research, but that also addresses needs of migrant and refugee families, so that is adapted to the local context. So that is very important that we focus on continuous, on our CPDs, not only on sending the workforce to courses, but that it's really that there are people who are coming in the centers and who are putting critical questions, we're asking critical questions to the teams, and that are the kind of interventions who are successful. And then the whole aspect of parent and family engagement is very important. We must go to more demand-led services and not that the parents have to adapt themselves to the services. And we must engage in reciprocal relation with migrant parents to respond to their input and to start co-construction service and provisions that have meaning to them. That's very important, that they really believe in that it has a very good influence on their children. We must avoid a kind of a labyrinth of services for very different groups. And what we have also seen in the forum is that parent participation, everybody is in favor of parent participation, but in different countries it has a completely different meaning. Sometimes it is the fact that parents have to do some things with their children. If they go home and they read books with their children, then in some countries that is parent participation. But I think real parent participation is a form of citizenship in which parents are invited to take important decisions in the early childhood centers. And we have seen that in very few countries this is the case. And then about evaluation. Very important is that monitoring and evaluation has to be based on a definition of quality, and then is the question, who defines quality? And in the forum, researchers and policymakers, was very interesting, they agreed on the fact that it's not only the task, because I'm myself a researcher, and researchers sometimes think that the researchers have to define what quality is. In reality, it doesn't work like that. I think that, we thought in the forum that quality has to be defined by researchers, but also by practitioners, by parents, by policymakers. Okay, and then we have also very important is, and we see it now also again with the huge number of refugees that are coming to Europe, I think we need integrated systems. It's very important that it's not only the school who is taking care of the children, but that we are seeing that healthcare systems, educational systems, that they work together. Very important is also smooth transitions between home and early childhood education. We see in a lot of countries that children have to adapt to school, and then we talk about school readiness, but school readiness means that the family is ready, that the school is ready, and that the community is ready for the transition. And if those three are met, then we have children who are ready for school. Another important thing is that especially for refugee children and immigrant children who speak another language, every transition represents a challenge. We are seeing that the transitions in the educational systems are tailored for middle-class parents. When our children are going to school, then we are preparing them and saying, next year you're a big boy or a big girl, and you're going to primary school, and it's great. With parents who don't know the educational system, for them it's very difficult to prepare children for transitions, and I think they need additional help for that. And also we need to make that the different parts of the education systems, that there is a kind of alignment to them, that there is a continuing curriculum in didactical methods and also in workforce and in governments. And then the last part is also very important, is the whole issue on multilingualism and multiple identities. I think it's very important in a lot of countries, a child which is bilingual, and when it is English and the national language, then it's seen as an asset. But when it's a language from, like, for instance, in my country, when it's Arabic or when it's Turkish, or when then it's seen as a problem. So I think children who are bilingual or trilingual, because a lot of immigrant children are even trilingual, that it must always be seen as something, as an asset for the child and not as a problem. And I think we think in the forum that there a lot of work has to be done to learn the early childhood workers to work with dual language learners, and it has to have more attention in initial training and in continuous professional development. So thank you very much.
That's a really important summary, and I think all of our participants will really want it to see that and to share that. We do have a few minutes for questions before the break. I know you're dying for coffee, so we won't take much time, but I did want to ask if there were any clarifying questions or comments to our panel. Go ahead, Hiro.
Thank you for this wonderful panel. These aren't questions, but just a couple of data points to add. Data from the International Rescue Committee suggests that among the roughly 450,000 children, Syrian refugee kids in Lebanon, literally 0% have access to early childhood education for the 3 to 5-year-olds. So, and 75% don't have access to primary education. So we have a tremendous need here. And then in the U.S. context, the 4.3 million citizen children of undocumented parents, data show much lower access to particularly means-tested kinds of programs that they're actually eligible for because of the parents' fear of enrolling these kids in public programs. And that goes for both child care subsidies and means-tested ECE programs. So I think there's some very sobering data to add to the very sobering sets of results there. And there's been a wonderful recent, very new study from about a month ago by Heather Kobal at the Urban Institute, Randy Capps at the Migration Policy Institute, and others looking at the experiences on child development of having parents who've been either deported or gone through detention or removal proceedings, with those effects on behavioral development as well as learning, school absence, those kinds of things that goes along with a lot of the information that Alison presented.
So I'm going to ask our panelists if there are any comments. I mean, throughout the whole presentation, I kept thinking about young children in the context of what we were hearing, babies and toddlers. And so I just wanted to get a response, and then I'll turn to this question. Any response to Kiro's comments?
I think from the U.S. perspective, at least to the best of my knowledge, we don't have an immigration requirement to access public school. As you know, regardless of your immigration status, you can actually access, and I probably defer to John in terms of child care services, but I know under Title I that children can actually go to public school. There's no restriction. Now, having said that, you know, when you have an undocumented parent, the idea of providing you ongoing education, because from time to time they move to avoid being deported, but even in the undocumented children, we didn't really have a problem of enrolling them in public school. But again, the challenge is, these kids didn't go to school. As I mentioned, that kids coming from Guatemala, mostly who spoke indigenous languages, had some difficulties, and we may not have provided bilingual teachers. That's it.
In the back and then here. We'll take both of them and then we'll...
Okay. I just wanted to ask the panel if they could comment on the current situation with refugees in Europe is that each country wants to pass them to the next. So it's like a relay race rather than any consistent or approach to providing shelter for unaccompanied children, for example. And I wonder whether we shouldn't start, NGOs and the society, etc., start with putting pressure on the EU Human Rights Department, because we still have countries like Ireland who have not signed up to international treaties on providing asylum. We have Hungary who has but doesn't adhere to it. The whole of Europe, the EU, aren't behaving appropriately to the international legislation that some have signed, some haven't, and that's a tragedy in itself. And I wonder whether we shouldn't be putting pressure on them even more than we are now. And my own country is an embarrassment in terms of their approach to dealing with the refugees. So I think there needs to be more pressure placed on the EU, especially in Brussels, around this question, because otherwise people will just keep playing the relay race. And I saw that personally between Turkey and Greece, where I'm a part of a project from the Institute of Child Health in Athens, looking at how Greece and Turkey can deal with providing shelters for children. And it's all in the future. Nothing is being done at the present moment. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. It's Albert, the forum member. I just wonder whether the parents should be also granted protective status if the children are already citizens of a country. All right, let's say a citizen, already a U.S. citizen, the parents are not. Should they be granted protective status until the children reach age of 18? I know in certain countries they do that, but should we advocate that should be a sort of international benchmarking or standard that parents should stay with children until they've grown up, rather than separate them? Maybe I'm not happening is they put the children in the country, born there, and then the parents get deported, and then the separation. And obviously they don't want the children to go back to the host country for many reasons. But I know we don't want to open the floodgate, but should the parents be granted a limited stay until the children become age 18 or a certain age limit?
Yes, thank you for those excellent questions. I'll just respond briefly to the last two. I couldn't agree more about the need to put pressure on the EU in terms of a responsibility sharing response to the current migrant and refugee crisis in Europe. I should say that that is a global responsibility, so the pressure also needs to be placed on governments all around the world to respond to refugee crises everywhere. That being said, if you want to see 5 recommendations for the EU, you can visit our website, which is hrw.org, and there we have a box with 5 recommendations to the EU. I won't relay them now, but you can look them up. I love the suggestion about a temporary status for undocumented parents of U.S. citizen children. Many of you may know that the Obama administration did attempt to put in place some reforms in U.S. immigration law. It wasn't exactly what you've described, but it was a notion that we should defer the deportation of certain categories of migrants in the U.S., and it included people with strong family relationships in the U.S. Unfortunately, those attempts have been stopped through litigation in U.S. courts at the moment, so many of those programs have not gone forward, although a few of them have, and I think they've been really important reforms. Another piece that we at Human Rights Watch have pressed for is and something that does exist in many European countries, is simply an assessment of the family relationship and of the best interests of the child before a deportation decision is made final. Unfortunately, there's no requirement in U.S. law, and in fact, no ability for many categories of parents to come before an immigration judge in a deportation hearing and say, wait a minute, you're going to hurt my child if you send me away. And so we believe that very minimal right would be an important step forward in the U.S. context.
I just want to add something. If you are a U.S. citizen child, you can actually file petition after you turn 21. So that's the challenge is, that period of time. So what happened is the children, decided to go with their parents to their home country. So by doing that, they may not be getting, proper education, proper care, but at the same time, they're actually living in another country, even though they're a U.S. citizen. So I think there's a lot of things. I think the idea of providing TPS status, as you know, we have TPS status given to others, including Syrians. But I think this idea is something that a lot of stakeholders have been pushing, and I think it's a wonderful idea.
So I'm going to close this out because I know you've been sitting a really long time. As you know, the breakout sessions will continue this conversation. I should also say tomorrow we're having in the afternoon what they're calling an idea camp that IBM is sponsoring to begin the process of thinking about how can we use technology in support of some of the refugee issues. So this is a first step to a second step, which will bring in technology experts to think through how they can solve some of these problems. Let me end this like this. Everybody can make a difference. Every step matters. Sometimes we sit here and we're overwhelmed after a day like today. But every person that takes a step, embraces a family, does something on behalf of a child, whether it's a personal action or a political action, it doesn't matter. It's do something is really the cause. It's our hope that all of you here today and all of those listening around the world will redouble your efforts to give voice to the concerns we heard today and to work towards collective solutions on behalf of young children and families, particularly those who are currently being profoundly affected by multiple armed conflicts going on around the world. It is in the name of all those people that are working with refugees and migrants around the world that we conclude today, and I want to end with the words of Nobel Peace Prize laureate and child rights activist Malala Yousafzai. We are really tired of these wars. I am speaking for peace. Thank you.